really try and stick to my word, but that's the thing that I break more than anything with myself, which stops me from being like God, is because I'm not keeping my word. I'm setting the bar too high.
For decades, Terrence Howard has been one of Hollywood's most outspoken critics of the very industry that made him famous. After a bitter and very public split from the Iron Man franchise, and after years of describing the entertainment business as a system built on favors, loyalty, and unspoken rules, Howard has repeatedly argued that the industry protects its most powerful members for as long as it possibly can. He has never framed this as a conspiracy theory. He has framed it as something closer to an observation drawn from decades of watching how the business actually works behind the cameras. And whenever a major star falls from grace, his theory tends to resurface in the public conversation because there is rarely a cleaner example of it than the story of Ellen DeGeneres. Ellen's rise and fall is one of the strangest arcs in modern entertainment history, not because it was unusual for a star to face controversy, but because of just how far she had climbed and how quickly the ground gave way beneath her once it did. For almost 2 decades, she was arguably the single most trusted personality on daytime television. Her brand was not built on glamour or scandal. It was built on kindness. And when that brand cracked, it did not crack quietly. It became one of the most talked about workplace stories in the history of American television. And yet, strikingly, very few of the celebrities who had spent years benefiting from her show were willing to publicly defend her. This script is not a claim that Terrence Howard named Ellen DeGeneres directly in some hidden interview. It is a look at how his broader argument about Hollywood's protective instincts lines up almost perfectly with what actually happened to one of the industry's biggest stars. Ellen DeGeneres did not begin her career as untouchable. In fact, for a period in the late 1990s, she was the opposite. In April of 1997, both Ellen the person and Ellen Morgan, her character on the sitcom simply titled Ellen, came out as gay in the same television season, in an episode that became known as the Puppy episode. It was a genuine risk. More than 40 million people tuned in, making it one of the most watched sitcom episodes of its era, and Ellen won an Emmy for the writing. But the backlash was immediate and severe. Advertisers pulled their support, some local affiliates refused to air the episode at all, and conservative advocacy groups organized boycotts against the network. Within a year, the show was canceled. For a stretch of years afterward, Ellen struggled to find steady acting work. A follow-up sitcom lasted only a single season. It looked, for a while, like her career might never fully recover. The turning point came from an unexpected place: animation. Pixar director Andrew Stanton believed her chatty, slightly anxious comic energy was perfect for a forgetful blue fish named Dory in Finding Nemo. Released in 2003, the film became a global sensation, earning north of $900 million worldwide and winning the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. That same year, riding the wave of goodwill from Finding Nemo, the Ellen DeGeneres Show premiered, with Jennifer Aniston as its very first guest. The timing could not have been better. Daytime audiences were hungry for something upbeat, and Ellen's format, mixing celebrity interviews with dancing, games, surprise giveaways, and emotional reunions, delivered exactly that. The show's ratings climbed steadily, and dozens of daytime Emmys followed over the years. But what made Ellen different from other daytime hosts was the brand she built around herself. Be kind was not just a sign-off line. It became a slogan printed on merchandise, repeated in commercials, stamped across charity campaigns, and eventually recognized in households well outside the United States. She gave away cars. She paid off student loans live on air. She surprised underfunded classrooms with donations for their teachers. In 2016, President Barack Obama awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, citing both her entertainment career and the personal courage it took to come out publicly in an era when doing so could end a career, which, for a while, it nearly did for her. With that reputation came real industry power. Ellen's white couch became something close to a rite of passage. Presidents, pop stars, Olympic athletes, and first-time viral sensations all sat across from her. A single appearance could turn an unknown performer into a household name almost overnight, the way it did for a teenage Grayson Chance, who went from a YouTube piano cover in Oklahoma to signing with Ellen's own record label after appearing on the show. Advertisers wanted their products near the Be Kind brand. Publishers wanted her name on book deals. Forbes regularly ranked her among the highest-paid entertainers in the country, with earnings in the tens of millions annually, and her audience across social platforms swelled into the hundreds of millions. By nearly any measure, Ellen DeGeneres was not simply a talk show host. She had become a multimedia institution. It is worth pausing on just how unusual that trajectory was. Very few entertainers who survive a public cancellation, as Ellen's original sitcom effectively was in 1998, ever climb back to a bigger platform than the one they lost. Most quietly transition into smaller roles, niche projects, or leave the industry altogether. Ellen did the opposite. She turned what could have been a career-ending moment into the foundation of an even larger comeback. Built this time not on edgy sitcom writing, but on a persona so gentle and reassuring that it became almost impossible for critics to attack without appearing needlessly cruel themselves. That, in hindsight, may have been part of what made the eventual reckoning so jarring. A host whose entire identity was built around being disarming and unthreatening was, by definition, someone the public had been trained not to scrutinize too closely. The show's format also gave Ellen a kind of leverage that few daytime hosts of her era ever accumulated. Because bookings on her program could meaningfully move a career, publicists actively competed for guest slots, and that competition quietly shifted the balance of power in her favor. Guests, particularly younger or less established ones, had strong incentives to play along with whatever bit or line of questioning Ellen chose to pursue on a given day, because pushing back too hard risked souring a relationship with one of the most valuable bookers in the industry. That dynamic rarely gets discussed in the moment. It tends to surface only in hindsight. Once a host's power has already begun to erode and former guests feel, it is finally safe to describe what an appearance actually felt like from their side of the couch. For years, there were signs that the show's internal culture did not entirely match its public image, but none of them were loud enough, on their own, to threaten what Ellen had built. Some of the earliest hints came from people the audience never saw, the writers. Long before the workplace culture became a headline, several former writers privately described a room where pitching material could feel tense rather than collaborative, where a joke that failed to land with Ellen could visibly sour the atmosphere for the rest of the day. There was also a widely discussed inner circle at the show, one that staffers reportedly worked hard to stay inside of, because falling out of it could mean professional isolation. Then there were individual moments with guests that, at the time, played as ordinary daytime television, but that were re-examined much more critically years later. In September of 2008, Mariah Carey appeared on the show amid persistent rumors that she was pregnant. Carey tried repeatedly to steer around the subject, but Ellen kept pressing, eventually asking her to drink champagne on camera as a way of proving she wasn't expecting. Carey reluctantly raised the glass without drinking from it. Weeks later, she suffered a miscarriage, and in interviews years afterward, she described that interview as one where she had felt cornered into discussing something deeply personal before she was ready. Taylor Swift, a frequent guest during her early career, became the subject of a recurring bit in which Ellen would show her photos of male celebrities and ask her to identify which one she had dated. In at least one appearance, Swift visibly bristled at the questioning and asked her to stop. She later said in interviews that segments centered on her romantic life left her anxious, because any offhand answer risked becoming a headline about her personal life that she had no control over. At the time, these moments played, mostly, as harmless comedic bits. In hindsight, critics increasingly pointed to them as small examples of a bigger pattern: entertainment built at the expense of a guest's comfort. Perhaps the clip that traveled furthest was a 2019 exchange with actress Dakota Johnson. Ellen jokingly accused Johnson of not inviting her to a birthday party. Johnson, calmly and without missing a beat, corrected her on camera. She had, in fact, invited Ellen, who had chosen not to come. The clip went viral almost instantly, largely because it was one of the rare moments where a guest pushed back on Ellen's version of events, live on her own stage. Around the same period, comedian Hassan Minhaj had his surname repeatedly mispronounced by Ellen during an interview, despite gently correcting her more than once. On its own, it was a minor, forgettable moment, paired with everything else that would eventually surface, though, Critics later cited it as another small data point in a larger pattern of a host who projected warmth but was not always receptive to correction. The most serious of these early stories came from Grayson Chance himself. The singer Ellen had helped launch into stardom as a preteen. In September of 2022, years after the peak of his time on Ellen's own record label, Chance told Rolling Stone that behind the public partnership was a far more complicated relationship. He alleged that Ellen grew controlling over decisions in his career, was openly critical of members of his management team, and largely disappeared from his life once his commercial momentum slowed. None of these individual stories, on their own, threatened Ellen's standing. A tense writer's room could be chalked up to the ordinary stress of producing a daily show. An awkward Mariah Carey interview could be written off as a one-time miscalculation. Taylor Swift's discomfort read, to most viewers at the time, as harmless teasing. Dakota Johnson's correction became a meme rather than a scandal. Hassan Minhaj's exchange faded within days. And Grayson Chance's account arrived years after the fact, long after the public had moved on from his story. But taken together, they described a consistent shape, a host whose off-camera behavior did not always match the be-kind persona built for the cameras. By the summer of 2020, that gap between image and reality collided with something the show's publicity machine could not simply manage away. On March 20th, 2020, comedian Kevin T. Porter posted on Twitter, now X, joking that Ellen was notoriously one of the meanest people alive, and inviting people to share stories about her, promising to donate to the Los Angeles Regional Food Bank for every reply he received. What began as a somewhat sarcastic bit produced thousands of responses within hours. A few months later, BuzzFeed News published the first in a series of investigative reports built on interviews with current and former staff of the Ellen DeGeneres show. What stood out about these accounts was their consistency. People who had never worked together, across different departments in different years of the show's run, described strikingly similar experiences. A workplace where speaking up could put your job at risk, where fear was more common than collaboration, and where a public brand built entirely around kindness bore little resemblance to daily life behind the scenes. The BuzzFeed reporting detailed multiple categories of allegations. Some staffers said they had faced retaliation after raising concerns internally. Others alleged they had been let go shortly after taking medical or bereavement leave. Several Black former employees described specific incidents of racism on set and said that complaints, when they were raised at all, were either dismissed or handled inadequately. One employee recalled being told to be grateful they had a job at all, after attempting to flag inappropriate behavior. Subsequent reporting expanded the scope beyond workplace culture into specific misconduct allegations against senior producers. Executive producer Ed Glavin was accused of inappropriate touching and fostering a hostile environment. Co-executive producer Kevin Lehman and head writer Jonathan Norman also faced allegations of inappropriate conduct. All three disputed significant portions of what was reported, but the cumulative weight of the stories was hard to overstate. Warner Media responded by launching an internal investigation run by an outside firm that involved interviews with dozens of current and former staff members. The findings of that investigation were never made public in full, but the practical consequences were visible almost immediately. In August of 2020, Glavin, Lehman, and Norman all departed the show, and Warner Brothers Television announced new workplace policies and expanded human resources oversight going forward. Then, on September 21, 2020, Ellen opened the 18th season of her show not with a dance number or a giveaway, but with a direct on-camera apology, acknowledging that things had happened on her show that never should have happened, and stating that she took responsibility as the person whose name was on the marquee. It was one of the more serious, unscripted moments of her entire career. But the apology did not undo the damage. Nielsen data showed a sharp drop in viewership through the following season, with millions of previously loyal daytime viewers simply not coming back. Some advertisers quietly began pulling away. Media coverage of the show shifted almost entirely away from its content and toward the ongoing fallout, and every new guest booking or promotional push was now filtered through a single, unavoidable question. Did the audience still believe in the Be Kind persona at all? For a woman whose entire brand had been built on her public image, that image had, for the first time in nearly 20 years, become a liability rather than an asset. In May of 2021, Ellen announced that the 19th season would be the show's last. She framed the decision as something that had already been planned, describing a desire for a new creative challenge after nearly 2 decades on daytime television. Whatever the internal timeline actually was, the show ended not with the celebratory farewell tour many hosts get, but under a cloud that never fully lifted. What made the aftermath genuinely revealing was not the allegations themselves, but who chose to respond to them, and who chose to say nothing. Ellen's couch had, for nearly 2 decades, been one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in entertainment. Actors, musicians, athletes, politicians, and viral internet personalities had all sat across from her, and many had directly benefited from the exposure her platform provided, sometimes at pivotal moments in their careers. Yet when her reputation came under sustained public pressure, the number of major names willing to publicly stand by her was noticeably small. Kevin Hart spoke up in her defense, crediting her support during his own controversy around hosting the Oscars. Katy Perry described her own experiences with Ellen as nothing but kind and thoughtful. Ashton Kutcher said he had only ever been treated with respect while working with her. And Portia de Rossi, Ellen's wife, remained her most consistent and vocal defender throughout, pushing back on many of the claims as inaccurate. That list, however, was strikingly short given the sheer number of A-list actors, musicians, athletes, and politicians who had appeared on the show and benefited from its reach over nearly 2 decades. The overwhelming majority of them simply did not comment publicly at all. This is where Terrence Howard's broader argument about Hollywood becomes genuinely useful as a lens, even without claiming he made any specific statement about Ellen by name. Howard has spent years describing an industry where alliances are carefully managed, where public loyalty is measured against professional risk, and where very few people are willing to attach their own name to a controversy that could reflect badly on them. Silence, in that view, is not neutral. It is often the safest business decision available. Publicly defending someone accused of fostering a toxic workplace carried real professional risk in 2020, at a moment when the entertainment industry was already reassessing how it talked about workplace conduct more broadly. For most of the celebrities who had once been eager guests on Ellen's couch, staying quiet was simply the lower-risk option. Howard's own career gives that theory some weight, whether or not one agrees with every conclusion he draws from it. After earning Academy Award and Golden Globe nominations for Hustle and Flow, appearing in the acclaimed ensemble film Crash, and originating the role of James Rhodes in the first Iron Man film, Howard found himself in very public conflict with studios over pay and creative decisions, a dispute that ultimately led to him being replaced in the role for the franchise's sequels. He has spoken about that period repeatedly over the years, often framing it as an early lesson in how quickly an industry can close ranks around its own interests once a dispute becomes inconvenient. Whatever one makes of his specific account of his own career, few would dispute that he has spent decades operating inside Hollywood's upper tiers, close enough to its inner workings to have formed an informed, if clearly personal, view of how the business actually functions when a star's usefulness starts to come with strings attached. It is also worth noting what silence does and does not mean in a situation like this. Choosing not to comment publicly is not the same as private disapproval, and it is entirely possible that some of the celebrities who said nothing did so out of genuine uncertainty about what had actually happened behind the scenes, rather than pure self-interest. Workplace investigations are, by nature, difficult for outsiders to fully evaluate, and many public figures have learned, often the hard way, that commenting on an unfolding controversy before all the facts are settled can backfire badly. Still, the sheer scale of the silence, set against the scale of the platform Ellen had given so many of those same people over the years, is difficult to fully explain away as caution alone. It is precisely that gap between how many people had benefited from her show and how few were willing to speak up once it mattered that keeps drawing comparisons to the pattern Howard has described. As public sentiment shifted, old footage began getting re-examined in a very different light. One particularly notable example involved several past appearances by Sean Combs, who had joked with Ellen about his parties and their friendship on multiple occasions over the years. After his own legal troubles became national news in 2024, those old clips resurfaced and spread widely online, with viewers combing through them for anything that felt different in hindsight. It is worth being precise here. None of that old footage contained any actual evidence of wrongdoing on Ellen's part. It became part of a broader, sometimes unfair, cultural habit of reassessing a public figure's entire history once their reputation has already been damaged, rather than evidence of anything new. None of this erases Ellen DeGeneres' own responsibility. She was the face of the show, her name was on the marquee, and she personally acknowledged on camera that conditions existed on her set that should never have existed. That accountability is real, and it belongs to her. But her story also demonstrates something bigger than one person's individual failings. How effectively the modern entertainment industry can build, market, and protect a persona as long as the ratings keep climbing and the brand keeps generating value for everyone attached to it. Executives, advertisers, agents, publicists, and networks all had a financial and reputational stake in the Be Kind image staying intact for as long as it was profitable to maintain. It was only once the cost of defending that image publicly began to outweigh the benefit of staying associated with it that Hollywood's collective posture shifted from active protection to quiet distance. That is really the core of Terrence Howard's broader point about the industry. It is less about any single villain and more about a system that tends to protect its most valuable assets for exactly as long as doing so remains convenient, and not a moment longer. Ellen DeGeneres built one of the most beloved brands in the history of American television around a two-word message: be kind. The fact that the collapse of that brand happened not through some outside attack, but through the testimony of the very people who worked closest to her, is what makes her story such a striking, if uncomfortable, illustration of exactly the dynamic Howard has spent years describing. Whether that says more about one person or about an entire industry built to manufacture and protect images like hers, is something audiences